Welcome to Windows on the World, and we're going to start off tonight with a quote from our show Progress, a philosophical approach. Are the followers of lies due the same divine justice as those that perpetuate or invent them? There was a time when it was reasonable to assume that if there appeared to be progress in understanding governing principles and awareness of the events which drive change, that understanding of the whole picture would eventually unfold and the bigger picture would become really apparent. In other words, joining the dots to what is actually going on. However, this is clearly not the case. The last several years or more have proved this. The biggest challenge is the undoing of wrong or useless information. Things have actually moved on since we did this show, and we did ask the question how to counter it and overcome disinformation and make progress. Things have actually got a lot worse since then. But of course, people still ask, why is this happening? When listening to repeated beliefs mixed with truths, there is nearly always some major error thrown in, which from that point on discredits everything which has gone before it, even if it was all correct up until that point. Well, for most, there is no easy way out of this. This interruption in the field stops all progress. It now appears that the distinction between those who consider themselves informed and those who actually are has considerably widened. What is the best approach to this in the respect of progress for anyone encountering these interrupters? It can only be, of course, to disregard the being told that many prisoners were going to be released from prison, but those who were arrested during the so-called riots, this kind of set-up situation that's happened where we've had the far right and the next day we've had the anti-racism riots, well, those people are not going to be released early. However, people who have committed probably a lot more serious crimes and crimes that have a guilty mind, which we're going to be talking about this evening, are being set free. Today, the BBC announced a step further. Extreme misogyny will be treated as a form of extremism. Well, what do they actually mean by this? Because it's not defined, like all of these so-called new offences. This is under new government plans, the Home Office has said. So, will all the old videos of mother-in-law jokes be revoked? Will these kind of jokes be now monitored for hate? So will comedians of the old school talking about these kind of subjects be monitored by people being put in the audience, by local councils, for instance? And local councils, remember, now have the power to stop anyone speaking. Even when I was speaking about what was coming with the new system, my talks were routinely shut down, usually just by someone anonymous calling the venue. And because people are so scared, and spineless if you like, well, the venues would cancel. But most often it was the venues who were in line with the people who they said they were trying to protect, of course. So, from now on, a lot of humour will certainly be classed as hate. So Miss Cooper said there has been a rise in extremism, both online and on our streets, that frays the very fabric of our communities and our democracy, when in fact there has actually only been manufactured dissent. Basically, carrot and stick approach. Put out the bait and the people will go for it. It says the review will look at the rise of Islamist and far-right extremism in the UK, as well as wider ideological trends, including, of course, extreme misogyny or beliefs which fit into broader categories such as violence. So the age of real terrorism now seems to be over. It will also, it says, look at the causes and conduct of the radicalisation of young people. Well, this is very interesting, isn't it? Because in the past, we had the radicalisation of young people, the radicalisation of young Muslims by MI5 and through British intelligence, going into mosques, finding patsies to be duped into either carrying bombs or being found with hydrogen peroxide and put in prison, foiling another terror threat to the British Isles and beyond. Well, Miss Cooper said the strategy will map and monitor extremist trends. Now, last week in the last show, we talked about the Institute of Strategic Dialogue and their assumptions of where terrorism actually comes from. And of course, this has changed from Islamist terror to homegrown terror. In other words, the people of the country, because they are actually becoming more aware of what's been happening, especially since the COVID agenda, are getting a little bit unruly, and they may be able to form alliances which could actually have some effect. For instance, when we put out our show, How to Oppose Local Councils and LTNs and all this stuff about the solution, there have now been plants put into these social groups called truther groups or awakened groups that are calling themselves officers of the local council. Because in other words, they want people to believe that they have people on their side within local councils. It's all phony, it's all crap. But this is how perceived threats are always managed. So, this Yvette Cooper goes on to say, it will also identify any gaps in existing policy which need to be addressed to crack down on those pushing harmful and hateful beliefs, again, undefined ones, and violence. She said, well, there have always been laws about inciting violence. There have always been those laws. But this means overriding basic concepts of law which allow for freedom of expression. Miss Cooper said that action against extremism has been badly hollowed out in recent years. The work will inform a new counter-extremism strategy which has been promised in Labour's manifesto, and which the Home Office says will respond to growing and changing patterns of extremism across the UK. The review is expected to be completed by October. Well, they must have had that in line for a very long time. It is one of a number of policy reviews, it says, Labour has announced since coming to power in July, including the Strategic Defence Review, the Spending Review and review of the National Curriculum, which we covered in a show, a recent one, about what they're putting into the National Curriculum. So now the post-truth world is well and truly here. As we're going to find out tonight and discuss, the post-truth world is actually where we are now. Everything is corporate speak, covering its obvious and no longer submerged objectives. So everything's really out in the open now. It carries on. Critics might argue that some reviews are a proxy for actual action, but Labour has pointed out that there has been no new counter-extremism strategy since 2015 and that an assessment of new and emerging threats is overdue. Now, this is because after the manufactured and helped along Islamic terror threat had served its purpose, it was then necessary to silence and subdue the host population through conflict and the governance of resolution. Hence, we have now the Muslims being basically weaponised against Christians. This is for a third-party interest which the more informed people will know about. It carries on. This article, it says, for some years there has been concern around incel culture. They make these words up, which are actually quite irritating because they're not dictionary definition words. They're these kind of stupid slang words, and I think people should really stop using them. Obviously, the younger generation want to use them because they become fashionable, but a good way of responding to this is not to recognise their words. It says an online movement of mainly young men who describe themselves as involuntarily celibate and blame women and alpha males for their problems. Well, that's not actually true at all. There's many people who are voluntarily celibate, and there's a lot of people who've had bad experiences and are actually involuntarily celibate. So it's nothing to do with what people are saying online. It's through actual experience that people decide not to carry on in a certain manner. That's just through to life experience. It's nothing to do with this garbage. So this is distorting reality. It then carries on to say in this article, a mass shooting in Plymouth in 2021 by 22-year-old Jake Davison, who killed 5 people before fatally shooting himself, was linked to incel ideology. Well, I think it was probably more linked to an unbalanced mind. You see, this is the point that we're going to talk about in this show. We're going to talk about the intent of the mind, the guilty mind. And that is such an important perspective with what's coming in. It says, at the time, no further policy action was taken, but incidents like that one, and also the rise of, wait for it, social media influences such as Andrew Tate, a self-proclaimed misogynist, may have pushed the new government to think again. So, the loud-mouthed opinions of a promoted asset have been used, of course, as the change was already planned. So this Andrew Tate is promoted for a reason. He has opinions on everything, but knowledge on very little. What he's very good at is being manipulative, because he's a narcissist. So what he'll do is he will tailor what he's talking about to the people he's with, to the audience he has at the time. And that is very important. So in other words, he is nothing more than a useful idiot to what has come in. So people who followed him have been basically following the government. And this is the point. So people who think they're anti-establishment because they're going against a politically correct narrative are actually more part of the establishment than those who are going against it. A change which had, of course, little to do with rhetoric of a loudmouth narcissist, but merely to clamp down on those who may wish to express the need for a change, or worse still, getting organised. That is where things really get clamped down on, and always have. People in the past, in fact, one example I know of someone who tried to unite Muslims after the 9/11 attacks was thrown into the back of a van, injected and died 2 weeks later. This is all fact. This has been part of the history of a group in London that's been meeting for about 25 years. They all know the truth of what happened. So, the easy way to do this is create groups, then demonise them. Audacious but obvious. But will anyone actually learn from this? And it is obvious, isn't it? Okay, good. Well, let's carry on then. After so much information in recent shows, here are some observations on the present. There is no need for apathy. There is no need for confusion. There is no need for repetition of past mistakes. This is an important point. It is said that a series of events can be repeated with the same result after the death of those who experienced it. In other words, in very short periods of history, the same thing can be repeated. It is said to be about 80 years. So you can repeat the same thing again after 80 years because one generation's gone. The 80-year-olds are all dead. So the new generation, with a bit of erasure of history and a bit of a change in the national curriculum, will never bother about history if they're given enough distractions, and they have more than enough distractions now. Of course, the internet, computer games, and these so-called influencers who actually manipulate the minds of millions. It is said that a series of events can be repeated with the same result after the death of those who experienced it. So, meaning the context and history is forgotten or erased. And this can be done in a generation with clever manipulation of historical events and obscuring of the past. This is why history is presently, of course, being erased. The history given is manipulated for the same reason. Nothing is new, it is merely reimagined and repackaged. So, in effect, manipulation, which brought big changes, can be repeated every 80 or so years. Meanwhile, something else has happened in the last 20 years to make this even easier. The wiping out of long-term memory through short-term distraction. This is on a day-to-day basis and now an even hourly basis. People's attention is distracted minute by minute. This has been an effective way of implementing rapid change, of course, through an ongoing series of distractions. But conversely, the population are lured into the comfort of repetition. This is sought, of course, in habit and ritual. Ritual and religion combined also create habit. It will be argued that good habits and routine are necessary. Up to a point, of course, they are. This is as a way to give structure to perceived reality. This is so, however, and it's only part of the story. The ritualization of habit creates stagnation and self-deception. This is where the zeitgeist of the times is right now, to be perpetually stuck. Combine this with rapid changes and shocks of every kind through the corporate media outlets, and on this less intelligent level, of course, there is constant and pointless distraction. This can explain why the public are reacting to public statements, which are just opinions, by what are called influences. But why are these people called influencers? Because they are allowed to influence people with their opinions. Is anyone allowed or promoted to do this? Of course not. Only those useful to the outcomes intended. They speak for or against an issue and neither have any influence on the already decided outcomes. Therefore, they are allowed to influence. Well, there are many of them, aren't there? There's thousands of them. At the moment, the public are being distracted and allowing themselves to be steered, not by well-considered principles, but by short statements or memes. These are not by philosophers, authors, or people with any knowledge. Just to repeat something which has no quality of information actually means nothing. So it is the cult of nothing. Knowledge is lost and opinions are formed too easily. Choose your side. Lie one or lie two. Right or left. Do you want to be far right and stand up for tradition? Or do you want to be far left and destroy it and be inclusive? They're both lies. In the past, people told their friends about their perceived achievements, of course. People with nothing to do would call each other for no purpose other than to gossip. Long phone calls of people saying nothing. This happens in social circles, of course, and wastes the time of all participants, people who sit around in cafes all day, jabbering and talking nonsense. In the present, this gossip appears instantly, of course, along with photos for the whole world to see. Along with pictures of their last meal, we get pictures of people showing themselves in places where they want to be seen. No one is interested in this, of course, but they press a button which says like and move on to the next pointless distraction. And then, of course, at the end of the day, they can't remember anything because they haven't focused on anything of any importance. So all discipline is being taken away by constant scrolling and distraction. And, of course, agreeing with influencers on each side. The two lies. And of course, nobody really wants to know this stuff about what everyone's doing. They just press the like button, scroll on to the next thing. This, of course, once happened in small, localized circles. But then with the internet, of course, one's trivia could be seen by all those who had accepted people who they know nothing about. Those people are now called friends, when they do not actually even know each other, of course, in any meaningful way. This has massively accelerated the necessary narcissism and obsession with trivia, which keeps the public where they are meant to be. Nobody is going to want this to be taken away, as it is seen by them as freedom of expression, and that's the trick. It is, of course, nothing of the sort. It is the modern slavery of the mind to spend hours of every day scrolling through nonsense, which has no useful impact on your life and no useful impact on the lives of anybody. The addiction to it is the equivalent of robotization, mental subservience, and of course a form of purgatory. It is with this in mind that influencers have been put into place. I'm going to have a quick break now and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. We were just talking before the break about how the for and against of the given narratives are distractions to an already intended line of action. In other words, the real and the stated goals. The stated goals, of course, are for the benefit of all. The real goals are, of course, something completely different. Also, once the public are addicted to trivia, they will achieve nothing. In the past, there were particular newspapers which specialised in sensational stories. Remember the News of the World on Sunday, or even the more ridiculous and funny Sunday Sport. But now, this is constant. Now stories, of course, have to be sensational to get attention at all. So when the Sunday Sport years ago came up with the silliest headlines they could find, like Elvis's brain found on the moon, they were just having a bit of fun. But now this has become the mode for all forms of news and media. Now, these stories have to be sensational to get any attention at all, as far as the public are concerned, which, of course, is relevant to everything we've spoken about in our shows, because the really important ones about communitarianism and how to take on your local council, which is where the power is, are ignored by pretty much all alternative and other media. So when we do shows which have a catchy headline and we're talking about something very current, people will listen to that, but they're not listening to the solutions that are in those shows. So this kind of mimetic warfare has worked against the public. The public are actually working against their own interests. They can be swept away, of course, into the two lies more easily. For instance, fake left and fake right, false arguments are all that now exist, of course. When people have these thought leaders or handlers and become the go-to permanent distraction, of course, there is no resistance. Therefore, what is being implemented and the real logic behind it is, of course, ignored. This is why people blame politicians, and they always look at the lie but never what's beneath the surface. The circus of events which covers up the need to take personal action, of course, engulfs all who engage with it. Like, for instance, Trump's cartoon world, the manufactured recent dissent, an apparent overnight resolution to stop the hate in the UK. People hang on this every word of narcissists and manipulators who are called influencers. The accepted platforms are full of their nonsense. And this is all because of the ability to instantly express opinions that are available to billions. Whether it is Andrew Tate, Elon Musk or any other, it matters not. Recently, the need to express opinions spread to what people thought were closed groups. And this, of course, is how people have been arrested recently for expressing opinions they thought were in these closed groups online. These groups are monitoring hubs for public opinion, nothing more. I mean, somebody contacted me a while ago who was actually imprisoned for what they'd said on the internet, because they just said, yeah, we'll do that, we'll get involved in that. Next thing, under anti-terror laws, they've got 18 months in prison. Well, these groups are monitoring hubs for public opinion, nothing more. The recent prison sentences for expressing opinions and falling into the trap of incitement is, of course, the result of 20 years of social media. People are so used to expressing whatever comes out of their brain, whatever knee-jerk reaction they have in a split second to the whole world, that it's hard for them to go back on that now. This is interesting, actually. When Facebook started, I was talking to someone. I knew nothing about Facebook. I'd never heard of it. I was talking to someone and they were talking about promoting ideas and information. And this person suggested Facebook, saying that it was a more serious platform for more serious people. Because at the time there was things like MySpace, which I quite liked. I thought MySpace was really good because you could actually converse with people who were quite famous if you had an interest in what they liked. I had many of these conversations with people who were well known and they liked it, they enjoyed it, and people who I'd been to see their bands. And it was much more of a respectful environment, where of course the Facebook environment is full of trolling. Well, that was then and this is now. But this is hard to imagine now, but the degeneration of minds has been a big part of this social media phenomenon. For example, imagine 100 years ago, letters had to be considered, written and thought about because the recipient would keep them and look back over them. They would become mementos. They were kept as artifacts of their lives and became matters of historical reference. The letters of monarchs, poets, authors and politicians are held in high historical esteem. Now everything is written one moment and forgotten the next. Imagine, for instance, if the Balfour Declaration had been on Facebook and Twitter. Well, it was the same thing because it was the equivalent of a post-it note. It was never actually a legal or legally framed document. It was just a loose agreement between parties. Well, however, everything is written one moment and forgotten the next, but it can be dug up when necessary, as has been found out recently. This, as we can see, was always its sole purpose. When people are imprisoned for knee-jerk responses which have not been considered, well, previous to the last 20 years, the law of old would have to look at the mind of the person who wrote it. It's called mens rea, the intention or knowledge of wrongdoing that constitutes part of a crime, as opposed to the action or conduct of the accused. Meaning, of course, the intent. Did the person intend the outcome of their action? Murder or manslaughter. Basically, we can have such crimes as involuntary manslaughter. There's lots of different nuances within the law which the judge has available when looking at the evidence. Of course, in the past, this also included what are known, of course, as crimes of passion. Did the perpetrator plan a murder, or was it manslaughter? Premeditated murder is obviously a lot worse than something done on the spur of the moment. Spontaneous flights of passion were taken account of. Recently, this has been completely disregarded. So someone might be drunk or intoxicated or on drugs, put something on Facebook, and they would next find themselves being dragged off, charged, and then put into prison within days. This has only happened in the last 6 weeks, of course. I mean, I remember on Facebook, people I knew, one of my friends who's no longer with us was a bit of an alcoholic, and he would go on rampages on Facebook. I mean, it was the sort of stuff that getting put in prison now. But of course, people said, oh, he's on one, never mind. But that was, of course, years ago. And this, of course, is especially in the cases of those accused of hate crimes and incitement on the governing social media platforms. Of course, this intention of the mind has been completely disregarded now. So what is also missing is context. Those imprisoned for their crimes of passion may have been intoxicated, of course, or literally triggered to respond. There is no evidence that anyone actually suffered from what they posted in haste. This is very important. How many people, how could it be proven what the injured party suffered? Who were the injured party? When someone says, I think we should go out and start some trouble to show the government, who were the injured party? They can't be brought before the court because there was no crime. In an assault, there is a victim. If someone is stalked or harassed, there is a victim. When this generalised post goes out, who are the victims? It cannot be proven. Therefore, in law, it shouldn't be able to be part of a system where someone is prosecuted for something where the effect has been completely unknown. That there is no evidence that anyone actually suffered from what had been posted. It is now deemed that it did, of course, and because it was offensive to the governing system, then that is enough to convict. That is the point. By saying this, you're inviting the government to arrest you. There may also have been context for their statements which has not been considered. Again, this is going against what a court actually is. However, the whole purpose of social media was to have global control of what is and what is not acceptable. The addiction to it, of course, is what is to blame. For example, if one had to sit with a quill pen and a piece of parchment and wait 10 days for the message to be delivered by coach and four, none of this would happen because the event would have passed by, of course, by the time the person received it. So in other words, you would not write something that you bitterly regretted and send it off because you'd have to wait for the morning, you'd have to get the courier to send it, and of course you'd go, oh, I shouldn't have written that. Now, of course, there's no consideration. Of course, this does not mean that advocating going back to writing in this manner is a good or bad thing, but it just brings up consideration. With consideration, one would not explode with such provocative comments, knee-jerk reactions. Also, previously, this sort of thing would be done in a closed circle and not repeated outside it. A group sat around talking, for instance, in an enclosed space. The result of spontaneous and meaningless interaction is why there is not more or real organised resistance to implementations which are against the natural law. So that's the outcome. So by spreading this stuff all over the media, it becomes pointless. I mean, can you imagine years ago, you would say, I challenge you to a duel. You would have to get your weapons ready. You would have to be up at the crack of dawn. You would have to have planned this well in advance. So, in other words, these spontaneous knee-jerk reactions would never have taken place years ago. And with this in mind, it is easier to see why the public at large are unable to organise, and even when they believe they are organising, they are in fact being organised by people they know nothing about, strangers on groups in things like Telegram, all operating under pseudonyms. Well, as in recent groups set up merely to implement the desired outcome. This was to create frustration and outlets for energy, called protests, giving the perpetrators the excuse to use the now ridiculous term far right on the indigenous population of a country. The news channels now read out tweets from people who have expressed an opinion. Can you believe that? A news programme goes through what the public opinion has said. None of these people may be real. They may be just troll accounts. So they just read out what an unknown person or maybe a fake person has said as a public reaction. There are whole sections of corporate news programmes which discuss what Elon Musk may have said. There is no real barometer, of course, of public opinion, and this certainly isn't a barometer of public opinion, is it? The reliance on a constantly changing and attention-seeking set of memes has overtaken consideration of all information. The need to keep information out of the public arena has been overtaken with the need to tell the world everything, every moment of the day. There is no more proof of this needed when the recent arrests for posts on Facebook have been taken into account. With this level of need and narcissism, there is no way forward. The most basic and obvious information about the dangers of putting everything on monitored platforms has been ignored. The reason for talking about this is because our shows have covered the infiltration of all groups, including virtual ones, which are the easiest to disrupt and monitor. All of what is known as society has different levels of allowed information. Therefore, information on public platforms is of little importance. This is especially true when it is from untrustworthy sources, such as corporate news channels. The age of deception could also be called the age of consent to be monitored and accept lies. And this is now how everything works. It has been stated, of course, on these shows that there are two objectives to every story, the real reason and the ostensible reason. The real reason is always ignored or buried. Well, how is this to be understood? The description of those in society is community. Well, how many times have we said that the community referred to by the governance system does not include you? It is an imposition from above, implemented through lies called consensus. Everyone appears to have agreed. Until this is understood, nothing will happen. All the problems complained about could, of course, be solved. This is why two sides have formed. In these two sides are a majority who fall for the two lies they have been given. They are always put between these two lies. They only have these choices, lie 1 and lie 2. These are the only choices presented or argued over. They will fight endlessly over the two lies which they have placed themselves in between. This means that they have agreed to have no autonomy. This is one of the basic elements of governance in the present time. The result of those state actors advocating free speech versus those who deem to be offended is the predicted outcome. The reason behind it, of course, is never discussed. Well, I get sent commentaries which are described as intelligent, which talk of the tweets of someone who is expressing an opinion or the contrived utterings of an agent provocateur. Nothing comes of this, and the distraction, of course, continues. Information is described as facts provided or learned of. So that's the definition of information. Facts provided or learned of. Therefore, nothing posted as opinion is information. Information has to have a through line of action, a story that makes sense. Therefore, no information is present in 99% of gossip channels or social media. It has been said that humans waste most of their time in unnecessary action. Well, now it is pretty much all of their time. As people in jobs which do not, of course, require much effort engage in online gossip all day, this has given the governance system another excuse to, of course, replace them with AI robotization. If one becomes a biological robot by choice, one cannot complain when another robot takes over their role. All of this is obvious but seems to be left out of the information field. The definition of conscious awareness has been manipulated, of course, and of course it's been misunderstood. Therefore, bio-robotization leaves out consciousness, the unified field, which we've talked about in our Perfected Mind series, which is now a little strand that I keep going alongside the shows because it's so important. Well, science, of course, is meant to be a tested hypothesis based on a series of well-proven facts. Well, this is, of course, no longer the case. We've talked about the corporate nature of what is called news. This is even more true in the field of what is now called science, of course. There has been talk over the past, since about 2015, I think, post-truth world was the phrase of the year. I think The Guardian called it the word of the year, when it's, in fact, of course, two words. This is where nothing is actually based on, fact. Let's give myself a drink of water. And, oh, that's better. Yes, nothing is based in fact. It now appears that even this has been surpassed. So it could be described as the post-truth world. This form of bio-robotization, though, is of course a choice. This is also left out of the equation, as all engagement falls under the rules of the real and the stated goals, and of course the two lies that people are placed between. Well, in ancient Greece, a criminal court would be convened, and it would be done in front of a jury and learned members of the community. And if there had been a murder or a serious crime, the incident would be reenacted, and a through line of action and the consequences described and played out as a theatre in front of those present. The judgment of the court would be based on the balancing of the two sides of the argument. The basis of belief is the law. Now the law is seen as what people are given, described as the common good. This is not whether a legal decision is true, it is whether it is deemed to be the outcome acceptable by the governing authority. There is no longer any equitable outcome within law. This communitarian law is all about what values people are given to accept. And all those who are deemed to be outside this are punished, as we have seen over the past several weeks. Combine this with the meaningless flow of what is wrongly called information, and there is no benchmark of natural law or truth in any matter whatsoever. One can see what happens when, of course, there is no definable truth. There are merely opinions. Therefore, for the last 15 years or so, any response to a matter of truth from a public official will start with, and this has happened to me many times, probably happened to you, I am sorry you feel that this is not correct, but. So what they do is they make it sound like what you've stated as fact is your opinion based on the way you feel about something. This is, of course, taking all information and known facts out of the equation. And then, of course, they insert any number of statements, such as, however, 99% of scientists agree. So they respond with a false argument of lies. The only way out of this is to exist outside all of it and only engage when necessary, being strategic and clever. Strategy is everything, because with strategy you can see a through line of action from beginning to end and the desired outcome at the end of it. Playing the game using the rules which have been left out of the game does not mean those rules do not exist, and that is the key point. The element of surprise and unpredictability is the enemy of those in this kind of corporate bio-robot system. On a personal basis, this is where I have seen real achievement in usurping the lies of this consensus reality. And in conclusion, they don't call it thinking outside the box for nothing. I hope that was thought-provoking and interesting. That's the whole purpose of these shows, to kind of get some response and maybe appeal to ideas and creativity, because that is, I think, where solutions are really found. So, in summing up, this is really a summary of what we've been talking about in recent shows. So, do stay in touch through the website. Thanks for the information which comes in. You can join our Discord group. Go to windowsontheworld.net on the homepage. You'll find links to where you can find all of our material. YouTube recently has been letting a few of our videos through momentarily, and the reaction to those videos from around the world has been very interesting indeed. So if you do have any information, it's info@windowsontheworld.net. You can support us on PayPal and Patreon if you'd like to do that, or you could join the £5 a month club, which helps keep things going, because I'm going to have to change platforms soon on everything. Things are rapidly changing, and there's going to be a massive change by the end of this year. So if there's any shows you particularly like, do download them, and maybe that's the way forward, downloading things and sharing things. That's what I've heard recently. In last week, someone in Canada said they've downloaded these particular shows that are very useful to them, and they're just circulating them within their groups. So we're talking about information here which is global, and remember, it's all global to local. So until the next show, thanks for tuning in and stay in touch.